Today, let's look at these two terms, left wing and right wing. What do we understand by left wing and what do we understand by right wing? These two terms come to us from the French Revolution of 1789. Now in France, before the French Revolution, they had a three-estate system. The first estate consisted of the clergy, the officers of the church. The second estate consisted of the noblemen, those who belonged to the court. And the third estate was made up of the peasants and the bourgeois. And this continued right up to the French Revolution, and then it was replaced by a different system. Now, let us look at the system in England. They had a two-estate system. So, in this system, the first estate was a combination of the clergy and the noblemen. So they made up the first estate, and the second estate was the group of, the common public. And this is how we get the two houses of parliament, which we recognize as the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, clearly, one of these groups is going to strongly stand for the upper classes, the aristocracy, the king, those in power. So they will form the right wing. And there will be another group which will stand for equality, redistribution of wealth, concern for the underprivileged, and things like this. This is the left wing. Actually, it is all about what the government or the country is expected to do for its citizens. So when the focus is on, order, hierarchy, so now we have the right-wing system. And when the concern is for the underprivileged, for those who are less than in some way, then it is a left-wing ideology. When we look at all these ideologies that we will be studying about in literary theory, the first thing to understand is that these are ideological responses to the politics of control. So there is a politics of control and it functions in a particular way, and you have responses to it. Those responses to the politics of control is what we know as various ideologies, which we will be looking at one by one. Now, how do these things actually function? How does the politics of control actually happen? Let's look at this. The first thing we need to look at is that there is a group which wants power in its hands, and for that reason it somehow tries to get that power in its hands. Now, how will it be able to do that? If one group wants power in its hands, what will it have to do? So the most basic thing, step one, look at this way. There's a group which believes that it is somehow superior to the others, and so it wants power in its hands. This is maybe the first stage of the politics of control. Now, in order to gain that power, it will somehow have to convince the others, those it wants to control, it will have to convince those people that you are in some way inferior, you are less than us. So the power which wants, all the control in its hands, that group, it will have to somehow convince all the others that you deserve to be controlled, you deserve to be ruled over, and you ought to look up to us, and you ought to let us rule over you. So in the second part to this, what we get to see is that at the receiving end is a large group which is somehow, being made to believe that it is inferior in some way to those who are trying to convince it that you are inferior to us in some way. And so you have to listen to us. You have to be under our control. So now this large group slowly begins to listen to that idea. And so the first seeds of doubt are now, planted. Now, this large group will begin internalizing that idea that it is somehow inferior to that powerful group. It will begin internalizing that idea. So, after a certain period of time, this group has internalized the idea that it is somehow inferior to that other powerful group. And then what does it do? It not only internalizes the idea, it also somehow tries to keep spreading that idea amongst the other members of its group. This is very important. So this group, which has begun to believe that it is inferior in some way, will also become the agency to convince the other members of its group that yes, we are all in some way inferior to that group. So we saw that it begins this way. A group wants power in its hands, and it knows, somewhere it believes that we are superior, but it also knows that it will have to convince the others. Those whom it wants to control, it will have to convince those people that you are inferior to us and you deserve to be controlled. And so that activity will begin. And then at the third level, that internalizing of that image will happen. So that large majority, which is perfectly okay in every way, is going to accept that label of inferiority which that, group which considers itself superior is hanging round its neck. And this group will wear it, it will internalize it, and it will teach other members of its group to also accept the label. Now, the next thing, reinforcement. Those in power know that this is not a one-time thing that we control some people and the story is over. This will have to be reinforced and reinforced. It will have to be repeated and repeated and repeated till everyone believes it. So once it does that, something automatic is happening. Now the group which wants power in its hands, it doesn't have to work very hard. There is already a system working. So now the underprivileged group, which somehow accepted that label, it too starts convincing the members, other members of its group, that we are in some way inferior. So that group which wants power is, absolved of that responsibility. These people will do it amongst themselves. And then reinforcement very conveniently happens through the pages of literature. So you read stories, you read texts, you read all kinds of things where again and again that same picture of this group being superior and this group being inferior will somehow keep getting repeated through stories. It will appear in novels. It will appear in small ways. But if you look for it, you'll find it. So reinforcement happens through the pages of literature. And so novels, stories, poetry, all these things, they keep reinforcing the same idea. This is the fourth phase. In the fifth phase, now that group which had accepted the label of somehow being inferior, it suffers and suffers and suffers for maybe decades, maybe centuries, and one day it sits up and it looks at itself and it looks at those people who have controlled it and it understands the game. So now it will position itself for a revolt of some kind, a response of some kind, which it had not been able to give long back. Now it will position itself for that response, for that revolt, and it will actually rebel. This is the fifth part. And that rebellion will be so loud, it will get its voice heard. And in the final phase, the sixth phase, those people will be thrown off, the labels will be discarded, and a new identity will get constructed. All along, once that internalization of the image had happened, what had happened was that this group, this large majority, was absolutely okay, but it just took on that false image, which that superior power, which thought itself very superior, it decided to hang round its neck, and it kept living with that false image. Till one day it decided that enough is enough, and now I'm going to, discard this label, which is not me. And so you have these isms. They are responses, ideological responses to a lot of injustice and to all that, politics of control. And then there will be a restructuring and a new identity will get constructed. And this is how change will be introduced. Coming back to the politics of control, let us look at this system through a system which we all understand, and this is the family system. So somewhere a group decided that we are superior and we have to be in control and the power has to be in our hands. So we are speaking of patriarchy. And so the male section of society decides that it is superior to the female section, and so it ought to have power in its hands. So this is that first phase. And then it has to convince the women folk that you're in some way inferior. And so it does everything that it needs to do. It uses biology, it uses you can think of anything, it will use everything within its power to somehow convince the women folk that you are in some way inferior. Then what happens? We reach the third part of this. So the woman will not only internalize that image, she'll somewhere begin believing that she's inferior. You'll see it in small ways in the home. Somewhere that belief is, becoming stronger, that she's inferior to the man. And then the woman will drill these concepts into the heads of other women. For instance, the mother will do it to her daughters. She'll drill it into the daughters that, no, this is how you have to be. You have to take a back seat. You have to be like this. You have to be like that. So whatever it is. So it'll begin at a very tender age. There'll be a difference between the way the brother is made to work and the way the sister is made to work, the choices that they are given in life. It'll begin in very innocent ways, which the girl will not recognize. But somewhere she's internalizing that image, and the mother and all the grandmother and all the other women folk at home are becoming accomplices in this. They are actually aiding the men in making all the other women of the house feel that they are somehow inferior. And so the game will go on. The image will be completely reinforced. It will get internalized so much. And one fine day, suddenly, the woman sits up and looks at herself. We are talking in terms of a family, but you can look at it as, the men folk and the women folk, and why things like feminism have to happen, or why they had to happen in the first place. So there will be, when there is too much of oppression and suppression, one day those dams will burst. And so the seeds of revolt are sown, and the revolt actually happens. And when that happens, those old power structures, they begin to shake, they begin to crumble, and they fall completely. Then a new identity gets constructed. Suppose we look at it in terms of what happened to our country, because we'll be looking at post-colonialism. So let's look at how this whole thing happened with us. What were the English people actually able to do with us? So they had this idea that they were superior, and they had this idea that they need to rule over the rest of the world. And so this group which wants power in its hands has to convince those whom it wants to control that you are somehow inferior to us. So let's just restrict this to our country. When you do post-colonialism, you can look at it in wider ways, but right now let's just limit ourselves to this. So they come here with that idea that we are superior, you are inferior, and then they transfer that idea to us, and somehow we accept it. We are convinced that yes, we are inferior to these people. Then what happens? That thing continues over a long period till we internalize that idea completely. So when we internalized the idea that we were in some way inferior to them, we were ready to please them in all sorts of ways. So we had hung the label round our necks and we were okay with it. Then what happens? The next stage, reinforcement. For reinforcement to happen, two things happen. One is the members of the victimized group, they start reinforcing the same idea amongst the other members of the group. So it was very much the Indians who somehow not only accepted the idea, they internalized it and then they spread it to others of their tribe. And of course, on a larger scale, it happens through the pages of literature. So you'll find plenty of texts in which you will find that the way Indians or all these groups, however, those people saw them, the way these groups are represented in the pages of literature is always insulting. So it'll be an unfair, untrue kind of a picture. So all that will happen through the pages of literature. And then one fine day, these people, for instance, the Indians, so they will sit up, they will look at their situation and they will decide to fight back and they want to shake off that label. They realize that the mistake that they have made is that they have chosen to accept a label which did not belong to them at all. It was their choice to hand it over, and it was these people's choice to just accept it, to wear it round their necks and to continue with that label. So that label was not of their own making. The label was made by them, but the label was accepted by us. So there is a degree of acceptance which is happening. And so that label is going to stick till ultimately something wakes up inside and then people realize that no, this is not fair. This is not fair to us and this is not our truth. And so that rebellion will happen, and then you will have all of those people being shaken off, those labels being shaken off. There will be revolt. You'll find it in, the literature of revolt. And a new identity will get constructed, an identity which is both healthy and which is more true. That kind of an identity will get constructed, and now that will be reinforced through the pages of literature. So post colonial, it's not about, 1947, they left us and went away. So post-colonial for us is from 15th August 1947. That's not how it works. And then post-colonialism is a large term. And it's not only about India, it's about several countries. We'll be looking into that in detail. So this is how the politics of control actually functions.